joining. My name is Ayaka, and I am a consultant with LSAT Unplugged. I have the great pleasure here today to interview the University of Louisville Brandeis School of Law Assistant Director of Admissions, Nicholas Stiegelmeyer. Thank you for joining us today. This is super exciting, and we're to get some insight into admissions and kind of law school and what to expect. So first, let me hand the mic over to you, Nicholas, so you can introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background.
Sure. Well, my name is Nicholas Stiegelmeyer. I am, as Ayaka said, the Assistant Director of Admissions and Diversity Initiatives for the Brandeis School of Law at the University of Louisville. I've been working professionally in law school admissions for the past 8 years. And so over that course of time, I feel like I've developed a good sense of expertise in terms of what students can expect and what trends we've seen happen and maybe wane or maybe come back with a vengeance. So hopefully I can offer that sort of insight. I know that for many of the colleagues I have in this admissions world, they may have been practicing attorneys before they went into the world of admissions, but I'm not among them. I actually started in admissions. I had worked in higher ed before I went to law school. And when I went to law school, I wasn't 100% set on a career change, but I thought this would be a good credential and I thought this would be a good experience. And as it turns out, it's been a great credential to work in the world of law school admissions. And so my path sort of moved from there, and I've been happy doing it ever since.
Wow, that's amazing. And I would love to kind of double click into your, your work history and kind of ask you what kind of drew you to admissions? Because it seems like something that you don't really think about when you're like, oh, I'm going to go to law school.
Oh, yeah, so no.
I would love to hear about that.
I feel, it's one of those career paths that I don't think anybody ever thinks about at any point in the process, right? No one says, when I grow up, I want to be an admissions director. But for me, higher education sort of has spoken to a number of things that I think are really important. I mean, I think higher education as a whole is very important. And so I wanted to be a part of the world where I felt like it was opening opportunities to people. And I wanted to be eventually a voice that could, maybe help to shape the way in which higher education would take its steps moving forward. But admissions work really speaks to me because it is a lovely mix of interpersonal skills, organizational skills, an understanding of how to sort of roll with the punches, take them as they come, but create processes that are going to work for everybody. And I would say that, I've met so many people in this admissions world because we're a pretty small and therefore tight-knit group. And everyone's wonderful and everyone is positive about the work that they do and happy to help students. So I think the one thing that students should take from this is that we're not scary. We really are nice people who like the work that we do and we want to be helpful. So let us be helpful for you.
That is wonderful. And yourself included, every admissions officer I talk to, they're also welcoming and they're like, yes, ask us questions. So I love that attitude. And I was very nervous, before to be like, hey, can I reach out to admissions? And it turns out, yes, absolutely.
Absolutely.
So I think that's wonderful. That's wonderful. So kind of to the meat of law school applications. Most students who are looking to apply to law school, they know about the LSAT, they know about, you have to write a personal statement, they know about like your GPA is really important. But I kind of want a little bit more granular and ask you some more questions about all of that. So, we all hear that the LSAT score is maybe the most important piece in your application. Do you agree with that? Can you give us a little bit more color on what that means in a law school application?
Yeah, I think calling it the most important isn't exactly right. It is certainly a very important piece of the law school application. But the thing with, it's not just law school applications, but that's what I can speak to. But the thing with these application processes is each of the components is there for a reason. And each of those components speaks to something in some way that no other component can. And the LSAT is no exception. And so with the LSAT, a lot of what it's speaking to is academic readiness, especially in the environment of a big, stressful, timed testing situation, frequently one that may be standardized, like the bar exam will be, or like the MPRE will be. But even if it's not standardized, if it's still that pressure moment of a stressful timed exam, like law school exams will be, it can still provide really helpful insight in that regard, just in a way that no other component quite can. The GPA, whether undergraduate or post-undergraduate, can, to some degree, speak to test readiness, because probably along the way you had tests, but it doesn't as directly speak to it. And so in that sense, it is extremely important for what it does. And so just like every other piece of the application, we talk about having a holistic review process. You'll hear that from pretty much every law school admissions rep ever. And just remember, for the students that are listening, that doesn't mean that you get a mulligan. That doesn't mean that we ignore pieces that aren't as strong. It means that they all work in balance. But any one component still is important. And if it is a true point of weakness, whether that's the LSAT, whether that's, you know, the writing quality that someone is exhibiting in their personal statement and other written pieces, whether it's professional judgment, if one of those pieces is too below the standard where we feel like a student is in a position of readiness for law school at this time, it can, even on its own, really hold sort of an anchor's weight and pull down your application. But for most students, that's not the case. For most students, it's a matter of sort of the balancing act. Maybe some things are stronger aspects and some things are less strong aspects in their application. And in that way, if the LSAT isn't one of the stronger aspects, you may still have other strong aspects that ultimately make you an admissible candidate.
Wow, that's great insight. And of course, you know, we all hear the holistic application. And so it's the loose side of that. And so yeah, it's the most important part. So thank you for that insight. Sticking with LSAT, you know, there's a couple theories out there, and these are all by students. So, you know, the truth of it is a little bit wonky, but you get students who say, you know, you really want to take it once and, you know, nail it and knock it out of the park. Students say, you know, they've taken it 2-3 times. How does that affect how admissions views the student?
Yeah, actually, it's interesting you say that, because not long ago, maybe a month at most, I was talking with a student who specifically said they had received the advice to plan to sit for the LSAT multiple times, which is just very strange versus the advice that we heard out in the world, out in the ether, you know, a decade ago, where very clearly people were being told, oh, no, only ever sit for it once. And I think the truth is somewhere in the middle, right? The truth is, in an ideal situation, you'll take the LSAT once, you will knock it out of the park, just like you said. Great, you never have to do it again, you never have to think about it again, you don't have to pay $200 more ever again. And we're great on the admission side because we see the score, we know what to sort of make of that, and we include it as part of our consideration process without it having to enter sort of a broader LSAT narrative. But it's also okay to take the test more than once, though the more times that a student takes it, try to get my grammar right, the more context that gives us, and sometimes more context makes a high score less reliable seeming. So for example, if someone has taken it one time and received a score of 160, great, bada bing, bada boom, 160 is what I'm going to think as I'm going through the admissions process. Let's say they've taken it twice and they got a 150, then they retook it and got a 160. Well, even without any explanation, I would probably understand the narrative to be they took the test. They didn't necessarily feel great about it maybe in the day, but certainly when they got their result back, they felt like, I think I can do better. And they proved that they could do better. And to me, that's a positive narrative. And while the other score is something I can see, it's not something that I'm going to focus on the way I'm going to focus on the higher score. But let's say somebody's taken the test, and you can, 5 times, and they've gotten a 140 and a 142 and a 143 and then a 142 again, and then a 160. Well, now the problem is, yes, that high score is a 160, but the narrative tells me that it took so many times to get there, and it was such a consistent performance level in all of the other attempts that maybe that 160 is a bit of a fluke. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't have any weight, but it does mean that I have to think about that as I go through an admissions process in terms of, does this score evince the student's academic readiness, or is it maybe not quite what it seems? Is this going to be a student who might need multiple times to pass the MPRE, multiple times to pass the bar? What sort of academic supports do I feel like they need, and are the academic supports we can offer going to be sufficient? So there does come a point where there is context in there. Now, that's a rare burger that a student's taking it that many times. I would say 2 times, pretty much you're in the safe zone. I don't think anyone in my industry at this point really bats an eyelash. So the students who hear, oh, you can't take it more than once, well, you can. It's really, it's not that scary of a prospect to take it a second time. And if you really feel like you can put effort into improving your score and see that result happen, more power to you. Once you get to 3, and especially as you get beyond 3, you are starting to flirt with this idea of, all right, I'm glad you eventually got there, but if it took several tries to get there, I'm not sure what to make of that in terms of a law school exam, because you're not going to get a do-over. And so I need to know that you can get in there and do it. But that being said, even 3 scores, that's not, it depends on what the 3 scores are. If I see a 150, 155, 160, to me, that's a very reasonable narrative of trying, seeing where you can make some improvements and making those improvements. If it's all over the map, if it starts sharply declining, maybe those are different narratives. I will say, for students out there that wonder, because I get this question still, although not nearly as much as I used to a few years ago, do you take the high score, or do you take the average? Right? That used to be a perennial question every time we went out to fairs back in the day when we actually could do fairs in person. And what I started to tell students was, any law school that tells you they take the average, what they mean is they're looking at all the scores and they're all important, but they still have to report their high LSAT scores. And realistically, from the sort of behind the curtain peek of what we do in admissions offices, we frequently have goals that are set sometimes by our office and sometimes set by people well above our office for what we need to bring in as a full incoming class, not necessarily as individuals, but in the aggregate once they all come together. And if a school has a set median goal for the LSAT, that high LSAT score is what counts in developing that median. So if they're looking for a median of 160 and you have a high score of 160, you help them with that goal, even if it's a 160 after 5, not quite as successful attempts. So it still will have some bearing, but when they say they take the average, they just mean we're really looking at everything. And ultimately, all of us are. All of us in law school will look at all that we can see on the report.
Yeah, and that's a great look behind kind of the curtain. And kind of a follow-up question to that. We get students who are non-traditional students who have thought about going to law school maybe 5 years ago, took the LSAT, and it's been 5 years, so they have to take it again, or it's maybe a couple of years and they've taken it a couple times, and so they may be on their 3rd, 4th try. From what it sounds like, that context does matter, but I would like to hear your insight into that. Does that matter? Yeah,
you're exactly right. The context absolutely matters. And I should say, out of full disclosure, you're talking to someone who took the LSAT 4 years before he ever went to law school. So my LSAT score was 1 year from expiration when I finally decided to apply. And I think with an older score, it sort of depends on how you scored. If you scored particularly well, there may be no reason to reassert that. And often, naturally, in a personal statement, possibly in an addendum, you'll have an opportunity to sort of give a little bit of additional context just so the person reading the application understands why there might have been that delay between the two dates. But I don't think that would really be an issue. Now, if it's an older score and it's not so successful, well, what a wonderful opportunity to retake. And like you said, because I'm going to be able to see the dates and that additional context on the report, it helps me because I say, okay, yes, the student got, let's say, keeping with our same hypothetical student we keep talking about, got a 142 3 years ago, but they retook it this past year for their second time and got a 160. I actually think that that shows that over the course of those 3 years, they buckled down in certain ways, or maybe they just did some sort of introspective thinking and realized even more strongly the passion that they had for going to law school, and that gave them additional drive and confidence going into that second LSAT. That gives me something to really work with. And if a score is beyond I think it's technically the current LSAT year plus the last 5, so it's almost like it has to be 6 years old before it truly falls off. But once it falls off the report, I'll never know anyway.
Oh, wow,
So,
okay.
at that point, you kind of get that as a freebie if the time between tests happens to be that long. But I would say generally with non-traditional students, I think sometimes there's this trepidation that, oh, I'm too old, I missed the boat, there was only one pathway and it was going straight through. And that is absolutely not true. Typically only about a third of law students in any incoming year for law schools across the nation are straight through from undergrad. The other 2/3 at least went out into the working world for a year. But many of them have been out in the working world for far longer than that. And I really like non-traditional students because I think they bring in with them very frequently a set of professional skills and more interpersonal experience with different groups of people and in different settings that really comes in handy going into a professional environment. Because yes, we're a graduate level school, but we're a professional school and we need people to be practice ready by the time they graduate. And I think that very frequently the folks who come in with 10 years of out in the real world work experience, they've got some real good professional experience to fall back on.
Wow, and that's awesome that we're kind of talking into the non-traditional student, because I have so many questions there. But for non-traditional students, it sounds like that's really not a big issue to have, experience in the workforce.
It's great.
Do you find that it sounds like it's a good thing? Do you find that students with a little bit of work experience and they found kind of like, oh, I want to be in this sort of piece of the law, or I want to work in this part of the law, having that kind of passion, does that elevate an application? Does that kind of hinder an application? Do you have any insight there to have a little bit of a set mindset going into the law school application?
Yeah, I mean, I think that anytime that I'm reading an application and I get the sense that someone has really thought about this, they've done their research, they've had their introspective moments, they've thought long and hard about this being the right path for them, I think when that comes through, it's always positive. And it doesn't have to come through with them saying, I already know exactly what I want my job to be 3 years from now. I've already pinpointed exactly where I fall in the world of law. Because realistically, a lot of people get to law school, and even those with very strong plans might see those plans topsy-turvy turned around because something happens that makes an area of law no longer as attractive, makes a different area of law that they never thought anything of suddenly very, very interesting and something they really want to pursue. So it's not that you have to stick to it, but when I hear that somebody has thought about it and crafted a plan, it means that I have a better sense of how serious they are about this, that they're not just sort of doing it to bide their time. They're not just doing it because they heard law school is good to do. They're not doing it because someone in their family pressured them to do it, even though they might not have a passion for it. And that level of seriousness which could be non-traditional students, but it also very much can be students coming straight through or students with 1 or 2 years of work experience. I think that plays really well. And it really, it is a value add to the application, as we sometimes say. I think on the other end of the spectrum, you don't have to know exactly what you want to do. And I think it's fair game. And I want people to be honest. I would rather someone tell me, I honestly don't know what I want to do yet, and I want to use law school to explore the opportunities. I would rather hear that than hear someone clearly just trying to make up something that they think I want to hear. Like, oh yeah, I want to do this because I want to be a public defender because I watched Law and Order and it seems really good. And it's like, oh, that's not, you didn't know what you said. And so I would say the value minus is when someone, typically in the personal statement, right? Because I'm not going to in any way knock someone for not having a specific experience.
Sure.
But if in their opportunity to articulate what their goal is or why they've even put forward an application, if they can't seem to muster anything, if they just don't have anything to say, that sort of isn't it's a swing and a miss. It doesn't mean that that person's not getting admitted. There's a lot more to the application than just that. That wasn't the benefit it could have been had it been a more well thought out piece. Now, I should mention, you also don't have to, in a personal statement, depending on the prompt, I'll say that every school can do their own prompt, right? But if the prompt is open, you don't necessarily even have to talk about what you want to do with a JD, what your goal is here. You could be talking about something else, and that's fair game. So I'm not really talking about those students. I'm talking about the ones who basically just say, and sometimes literally in these words, I want to help people. Because if that's all you've got, unfortunately, the question I'm going to immediately ask myself is, well, then why don't you want to be a doctor? Doctors help people. Why don't you want to be a teacher? Teachers help people. Why don't you want to work at a grocery store? Clerks help people. All of those are very helpful professions. So why this? Yes. So give me something to chew on.
Amazing. And I'm like, oh, I have so many follow-up questions to that. But, and I kind of want to use myself as an example. I'm a non-traditional student applying to law school this cycle, and I actually have a background in cybersecurity. So it's kind of like a niche moment. And I run into this all the time when I'm researching a school to apply to, and I'm kind of, all over the map. I'm like, I'm ready to go anywhere and everywhere. And I'm like, oh, but if I have a personal statement that's writing specifically about that field, but if a school doesn't have, maybe a curriculum or some sort of I feel like, am I justified in applying to that school? And I'm sure there are students, non-traditional students out there who feel that way if they were in a very niche sort of industry or something like that.
No, yeah, I think that's a really great question. I don't think that the risk is, I think if you want to apply to a school, even though you're not seeing that it already has a strong foothold in a particularly niche area of law, I think that's fine, because you might have other reasons that that's a really good fit for you, and they might be really excited to get somebody because that helps them develop that area of law in a way they haven't had the opportunity to do so before. So I don't think that the risk is that anyone in the world of admissions is going to say, well, but this candidate wants to do something that we don't really do. I don't think that's a risk. I think instead, it is fair game if you're in that narrow of an area to say, okay, if a school does have particular supports in this area, maybe I really want to think about that because I can make use of the connections that already exist there. You don't have to, but it might be something to think about. But I don't think it would ever be held against you. And I can say too, that with cyber law, law and technology, IP generally, and really anybody with a STEM background, law schools are going to fall over themselves with excitement that there are these sorts of candidates out there, because they are not the dime a dozen that a political science major or criminal justice major is. Not that there's anything wrong with either of those majors, but you would expect, it would make sense that students interested in the law might have been such an interested student when they got to undergrad and therefore chose a major that is in that same sort of road. But we love getting students from all sorts of backgrounds. And so when we get those rare birds who come in with strong backgrounds that will help them in something like cyber law, it's really exciting for us. So I would say you hold all the dodgeballs here.
Well, that gives me so much like calm and peace, because I look at all the schools and I'm like, I want to go to all these, I'm so interested in all these programs, and I do interviews with admissions officers all the time, and I'm like, oh man, they don't have a cyber, is that going to go against me? And I've heard many students in the LSAT Unplugged universe kind of talk about that. So I'm so glad to hear this advice, and the expertise that a student can bring is a positive for that school. So that's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And kind of going on this trajectory with non-traditional applicants, the GPA, some students are saying, like, I'm 5-10 years away from undergrad, maybe even more. How is that GPA going to be weighted, whether good or bad? They're 10 years out, they have a career. What does it look like for them?
Exactly. So I think the broader reality with the undergraduate GPA is that it just has more context than the LSAT, right? Mm-hmm. Because there's so much more going on that gets us to this one little number, right? It's all about, okay, but what coursework did you take to get there? How long ago did you take that coursework? What were your trends in grades? Because often people start in an area of study that it turns out they just don't have the passion for, they just don't have they don't feel like comfortable with what they're doing, and it bears out in their grades. But then they find that thing that really speaks to them and their grades rocket upward. And so all of these are sort of pieces that matter in looking at an undergraduate academic record. And I say undergraduate, but we should mention, of course, anything post-undergraduate is also really important. It might not bear into the literal number that LSAC calculates and that we have to report out, but it doesn't make it unimportant. And so for a non-traditional student who, let's say, is 5-10 years out from where their undergraduate GPA was, I'm going to look at that and say, and I shouldn't act like every single reviewer in the nation at every law school would do the same thing, but I think many reviewers would do what I would do and say, okay, well, maybe this number isn't as strong as I would hope, but at the same time, this is from 8 years ago.
Right.
That's a long time. And I'm not sure it makes any sense for me to hold someone to their academic performance level 8 years ago, especially if, and this may be true for some non-traditional students, they have graduate work since then. Well, maybe then I look to that graduate level work because that's more contemporaneous. And also it's perhaps a little bit more of a parallel to law school performance insofar as in undergrad, you're taking this, that, and the next thing, right? So if you're really, really great at language-based classes, but you struggle in quantitative and math-based classes, well, you're still going to have to take them to get your undergraduate degree, but you wouldn't have that same burden placed upon you in the graduate world. And so maybe that graduate GPA gives me a little bit better insight. The time matters in terms of, how long did it take the student to get their degree? And what I mean is sometimes someone is a non-traditional student, but they did just graduate. It's just that there was a large gap within their undergraduate history, and that matters because then I'm going to say, well, the first 2 years that were 12 years ago, I'm not going to give nearly as much shrift as I'm going to give to the 2 years that just happened and the student was so successful in those years. And so all of this context really does matter. Now, again, peeking behind the curtain, just like with the LSAT, there can be goals in place for reportable undergraduate GPA medians, or sometimes 25th and 75th percentiles, but typically the medians are where most goals land. And so it may still matter in some way. Typically, it may have a little bit more bearing in terms of the scholarship offer that a student might get, more so than their admissibility. But even then, it depends on the school, it depends on how they've decided to structure scholarship allotments, and it might depend on individual students. I think often schools will say, you know what, normally I would think with the following things I'm seeing on paper that I would give this student X amount, but I want to give them X plus because I really like something else in this file that not quantifiable, but I think is really important. So it's not like it's the all end all, but I will say that it will take a bit more of a firmer hold on scholarship decisions than it might on admissibility decisions. What I would say for any student who has a GPA that they feel requires a little bit more narrative to understand, you always could include an addendum with your application that helps provide that additional narrative. It's not that it's a whole new personal statement. It's actually supposed to be, you know, short, sweet, to the point. But if you say something like, you may notice that I started my undergraduate career 10 years ago. I had a couple of years where my grades weren't so hot. I took a few years off and I returned. And let me help you understand that when I first went, I just wasn't ready. I thought I was picking something that made sense for me, but it really didn't. And I was so proud of what I was able to accomplish when I returned. Something like that can really go a long way to just helping me understand what's the story here, so I'm not inventing something that isn't necessarily accurate.
Right. And just double clicking into addendas about your GPA. We get questions all the time about students who ask, do I need to explain 1 B- or 1 C in my, in my whole undergraduate career? I like to say, do you really want to call attention to that 1 C that you have? If it's a string of them, maybe you want to explain it, but if it's one, I mean, it's pretty obvious, but any comments there?
I mean, because I would agree that, I like to tell students when you're writing an addendum, I call it the triple X approach because there are 3 X's to it, right? It's explain something that calls for explanation, do it expediently, and don't make excuses. And typically the first of those is the lowest hurdle to hurdle, but that is the first hurdle, which is, does this even need to be explained? And if it's a grade that wasn't so hot, not, a B- or a C is fine, they happen, right? It's not, you didn't get an F.
Sure.
And even if you got an F, okay, well, what else did you do? And how did you sort of manage from that point, right? But I would understand if someone wanted to write an addendum about an F in a way that I wouldn't understand if they felt compelled to write an addendum about a C. Because I agree, it's just like, why are you highlighting this? I would have seen it and been like, oh, okay. It's like that would have been my whole thought process of what that was. Now, granted, I'm not coming to you from a Harvard or a Yale or a Stanford, and maybe they would look at it a little bit differently. But even then, I don't really think they would for a single grade. I do agree that if you have sort of a string of them, or if you have a term in your academic history that's clearly a mismatch with the rest of how your academic performance has lined up, that might be a strong candidate for providing that addendum, partly so that I understand the context. But even if that one really bad term was you just saying, I dropped the ball, I decided to take these classes, I probably had a little bit too much fun that term, and I just didn't do what I was capable of. Even if you just say that, the fact that you take responsibility and the fact that you are letting me know that you acknowledge that this was a weird term can sometimes be a really positive thing. Because if somebody has 4.0, 4.0, 4.0, 2.0, 4.0, and they say nothing about it, that makes me raise an eyebrow more than anything. Like, you didn't think this was important to address? Now, I will say, since we're talking about Addenda, the other thing that I think we very often see is somebody basically writing a "please excuse my LSAT score" addendum. If a student is going to write that kind of an addendum, they just need to be mindful of what they're saying and what that communicates to us. And I mostly mean that sometimes we get students who say, "I'm not good at standardized tests." And that is not a strong choice, because what you're telling me then is you're going to have a difficult time on the MPRE and you're going to have a difficult time on the bar. And why are you trying to tell me this? And if you then say, "See, look, I did great in undergrad, but I did really bad on my SAT," then again, you're telling me, okay, so you're going to do great in law school and then you're going to fail the bar?
Right.
My job is to bring in people who are going to be successful on the bar, because it's not fair for me, not for the perspective of other students. It's not fair for me to do to you as a student, if you aren't going to pass the bar, to make you go through 3 years of this to do something that you gave me reason to believe wasn't going to happen. So instead of writing that, how about writing something like, "While I was disappointed with my performance on the LSAT, I'm very proud of what I've been able to accomplish with my undergraduate academic history." Sure, you're not telling me to ignore the LSAT. You're just saying, "I'm really proud of this other thing. And I acknowledge that I have a weakness in this one place." And if you say something like, "I'd be very open to working with academic support services to improve my performance in testing situations." Great. You're giving me something to work with. You're still addressing the same thing, but you're not doing it in a way that scares me. So there's a little word to the wise.
Oh, that's amazing. In kind of the same vein on addendas, there's people out there who kind of write addendas about things like gaps in their resume, or and especially we got this question a lot in the last year, gaps in their resume due to the pandemic. And I like to say, keep it short and sweet. We all know what the pandemic was, regardless of how that affected you, but we know we've all been through it. So I've gotten long 1-page, 2-page addendas about like what happened during the pandemic, which is an important story for this person to tell. But as admissions, I don't know how to word it right, but how does that look in terms of an addenda, and is that absolutely necessary to write?
I would say it's not necessary. So that's an easier question. I wouldn't say it's necessary. I think it's fair game if you have a break in employment and you want to acknowledge that's there, and you want to say, as many people experienced, I experienced difficulties in the job market due to the pandemic. And for this period of time, I was without a job. Because, okay, you're acknowledging it. I understand that you're acknowledging it. Now I don't have any question when I look at your resume of what happened during this time period. And that's fair game. If you didn't want to include it for whatever reason, I think probably a reasonable admissions reviewer would be able to figure out, okay, this is probably what happened. They might not have felt comfortable talking about that. That's probably okay. It also depends on the size of the gap. I mean, I've had people that have written an addendum because they had 1 month without a job. And I just want to pat them on the head and say, it's okay. You're allowed to have a month without a job. Once you get to 6 months, especially if you get to a year, yes, I would expect to see something that just acknowledges it and helps me understand. But if it's a month or two, that sometimes happens, and I get that. So that wouldn't need explanation. You could include one, but don't feel like you're obligated. What I will say, though, is, the addendum isn't intended to be personal statement number 2. It's not intended to tell a whole new story. And so for students that do have the instinct to give me sort of this full narrative of what COVID was for them, I think it's a little bit of a misstep. And I think there could be some admissions professionals out there who would read it and say, but that's not what we asked for. And it's not that I'm mad that you're telling me information. It's that I'm concerned that you're not reading what we're asking you to provide. And you're deciding, you're either not reading it or you're reading it and deciding, yeah, but I want to do this anyway. And neither of those is a good look. And so I would encourage students to remember that typically an addendum isn't meant to be a whole new narrative. Short, sweet, to the point is very much name of the game. And so, and I think especially with something like COVID, I mean, the fact is we all experienced it, right? And nobody had a great time of it. Certainly people had different experiences within it, but unless, you know, I think a student can do a reality check on themselves and say, unless your experience was truly so, you know, 0.01% of people experienced this, that it was really something that someone wouldn't understand unless they were told, they're going to get that it was scary and jobs were hard to come by. And the one that we were getting were people who were saying, you know, COVID made it very difficult to focus on my studies, and that's why my grades went down. Or sometimes people even said, you may notice that I took grades on a pass-fail scale. And some of those, it's like, you know, it's as long as it's short, sweet, and to the point, I don't mind getting the information. I will say to the students that try to use COVID as an excuse, because that's what they're trying to do. They're saying this is why it wasn't my fault that my grades went down. That's a hard argument to make, because remember, you're in a pool with a whole bunch of people that also experienced COVID, and unless all their grades went down, that doesn't fully explain what happened here. So that's not necessarily your best choice. But for those that just want to explain, here's why my grades are suddenly pass fail, that's fair. It's probably also on your transcript, like probably your university had some note on there. But if you want to, that's totally fine too. As long as you're short, sweet, to the point, take the responsibility you need to take. That's the big thing with the addendum, right? Is don't shirk the responsibility and try to tell me why I should ignore something or why something isn't really who you are. And it's not, this isn't the time for that. This is the time to just give me information and say, you know, I own up to what I need to own up to, and I wanted you to have this information.
Yeah. And it, you know, we're not going to forget fall 2020, spring 2021, anytime soon. So yeah.
Don't worry. I will go in with great sympathy no matter who it is.
Right. Kind of shifting gears to personal statements. You know, as we talked about, there are schools with free prompt that say, tell us about yourself, anything you want. There are schools that say, you know, please answer what school or why our school. You know, there's different degrees of prompts. I feel like I know the answer to this, but how important is it to actually answer the prompt?
Very. If they give you a prompt, it's because they want you to answer that prompt. And I will say, I don't know that every school does this. I wouldn't think every school would, but I did know of a school that used one of the check boxes that we have in the record system that all of us have to use, and we can sort of, you know, make some of them specialty fields specific to our school. They used one of the check boxes as did not answer prompt. And if they checked that box, you were second string at best. They already weren't going to be looking at your application as a first string applicant because you couldn't even follow that instruction. And I would say more generally, it's really important to follow instructions. That's part of the application process, is how well do you follow instructions? If I gave you a page limit, did you stick to the page limit? If I told you it needed to be double spaced in 12-point font, is it double spaced in 12-point font? And just remember, we read so many of these, I can tell you immediately if it's 11.5. I can tell you immediately if it's 1.9 line spacing. Like, don't try it. Do what you're asked to do. And a lot of that is because things like that are going to happen in the legal profession. And you don't have the right to tell the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, well, I don't want to do my footnotes in 14-point font. It doesn't matter. You have to. And if you don't, your filing will get rejected. So use this as the opportunity to show your good professional judgment by always following instructions, and prompts are a part of that. But prompts take in a special place there because okay, if I have someone that's otherwise an amazing candidate, but they didn't double space their personal statement like I asked them to, I'm gonna roll my eyes, but I'm not gonna say inadmissible, right? But if I wanted to know something specific, and I should say, we actually have a very open prompt. Ours is very much say what you want to say, so it doesn't matter from us. But if I were at a school where I had a prompt, it means I want to know what I'm asking about. And if you decline to tell me that information, why should I really think of you as a strong candidate when I've got other candidates who will answer what I'm asking them to answer? So it is important to follow those prompts. I would also say, while we're talking about, writing potentially specific personal statements to specific schools, that's a fair choice, because some of them will be prompted, some won't, and you might want to talk about something different depending on the prompt or lack thereof. If a student does that, though, they need to be very mindful to not forget that they personalized it in then submitting it to another school, because we've all at various schools gotten that, where it says, and that's why I want to attend the university, for us, it could be the University of Kentucky, Rosenberg College of Law. And I'd say, you should. That would be a great thing. So be mindful, of course. That's typically more often something students have to think about when they ultimately just want to turn in the same personal statement to more than one school, but they feel like it should be personalized. One, it really doesn't have to be personalized. I would never notice if it weren't. And I would not think anything of it. So maybe save yourself the grief and save the risk by just not doing that. But if it is specific to the school because of various prompts, do make sure that you're uploading the right document to the right application, because that's, you don't want to show your hand that you're applying to this other school and whoopsies, I turned the wrong one in. So, but yes, do write to the prompt, please.
Yes, absolutely great advice, and advice that I give all the time. I'm like, don't risk it.
Don't risk it.
Right. Stay clear. With the personal statement, how important is it to have a really strong personal statement? Because some people, they're so focused on the LSAT, they're done with their, undergrad, but they're like, I need to focus on the LSAT. I'll write my personal statement in a week, and I'll turn it in. And I come across that and I'm like, oh, that's probably not the best idea. But how important is it to do well and write a really strong personal statement?
I mean, I think, I said earlier that every piece of the application is important in its own way. And so that's the thing, is you can't just decide, I'm just gonna wing this one because I really want to focus on this other piece. You need to find a way as an applicant to give each piece what it is due in terms of time and energy and effort. With the personal statement, what I'm not going to say is important is it's not important that I see specific content. I think sometimes students think I'm looking, or we, the general we, are looking for something specific. We're looking for you to say something specific, and we're really not. I want you to be honest. I want you to just tell me what you want to tell me. Tell me the thing that you think it is important. I know when you're given only this 2 or 3 page moment to tell me things. But what I will say is important is that it is written well. Whatever you have to say, it needs to show that you have strong writing abilities, because if it shows that you have a weakness in writing, or if it shows that you didn't put the care in that you should have put in because there are careless typos and, sentences that trail off into nothing, and you can't put together a cohesive thought, that's a real problem. And even if somebody, I've said this to many students, we're not, up at the tippity top of the rankings. So we're probably never going to get somebody that has a 180 or 4.0. But if we got an applicant who had a 180 and a 4. I guess a 4.33, since that's possible from LSAC.
Oh, wow.
if they were the most, on paper, everything looks great, except when I get to the pieces of paper that make up that personal statement. And then they just totally whipped it. Just nonsense, makes no sense, has no point, seems to have no idea what a complete sentence is. I don't think I would admit that student. It doesn't matter that their numbers are what they are because they just didn't make it happen here. So it is important to do a good job with it. Now, does that mean that every single person I've admitted has an impeccably written personal statement? No. Sometimes people, it's not the strongest effort that I would have hoped for, but it's workable. That's what's important, is that it shows me that you have the building blocks to become, if you're not already, a strong writer through what we can do in our legal writing curriculum, so that when you get into the professional world, you have the writing skills necessary to survive. So I would say, when students say, I'll just bang this out in a week, give yourself more time, because you want to give yourself time to go through a real proofreading and editing process.
Right.
Give it to other people, get their opinions, get their thoughts. It doesn't mean they're all right, but get them and see what that helps you to notice that you might not have noticed in rereading it yourself. And I would say, don't forget your other written pieces. So many times I've seen a personal statement that's very polished, well written, clearly, shined up on all the edges, everything looks great. And then I get to an optional statement or an addendum, and it's not even in the same font. It's clearly just slapped together. It doesn't have the same, it doesn't seem to have the same grasp of how to put together a sentence. And that's not great, because if that happens, then it makes me call into question whether you went through the editing process so hard that maybe other people were kind of helping you write that personal statement. So don't let my mind wander there. Give me a strong piece of writing every time you have a piece of writing to put forward, and then you're putting yourself in the best position.
Yeah, and that's so important, to give the same amount of attention, maybe not the same amount of time, especially because personal statement is so big and, necessary. But that's great advice. And kind of sidestepping a little bit, I know there are applications out there who ask for optional essays. They might be a video submission. There might be some creative pieces. How important is it to actually do those and do all of them, or just some of them, or where do you sit on that?
I think there you would want to talk to the individual schools to get their sense, because I think reasonable minds can certainly differ. I mean, reasonable minds can differ on a number of things, but I think here especially, I am of the opinion that if it is optional, it would be a really dirty move by a school to then say, oh, it was optional, but actually we're really going to hold people that haven't done it. Well, then it shouldn't have been optional.
Sure.
So I think if it's optional, it really is your choice whether to put that forward. What I would say is it's a great opportunity. So if you have something to say toward that piece that could be really impactful, why not say it? Why not take the time to do it? Because that could be something that's really valuable in your file and that the person reading it really responds to. On the flip side of that, if you truly don't have anything to say and you force yourself to write it, we're going to tell immediately. We can tell. And I'll say, one type of optional essay that you do see out there with a lot of schools is a diversity statement.
Yes.
But if a student writes the diversity statement and clearly really didn't have anything they had to say, and I'm saying, I've gotten diversity statements that say, I'm diverse because I'm a middle child. I'm diverse because I have freckles. And it's like, no, that's you have not read the room correctly. But I think it's because they feel like, am I going to get penalized if I don't write this? And I hope that at least for our application, students understand that no, you're not penalized for not including one. It's just like an addendum. You don't have to include one. If you do, great. If you don't, okay, that's fine too. With the optional essays, I think the difference, of course, is frequently they are a prompt that anyone could answer. So maybe they're not a diversity statement, maybe they're a statement that says, you know, tell us more about the area of law that you think you might go into and why. Hypothetically, anybody could answer that.
Sure.
But if someone really doesn't know and starts just trying to squeeze something out that they don't really have to say,
Yeah.
it's probably not going to be a great piece. But for those who do have something to say, what a great opportunity to say it. And I would say, be mindful of what those optional essays are and if you're choosing to write them, because sometimes that can help you decide what you want to include in the personal statement.
Yes.
Because, well, you have these different opportunities, so you don't have to be redundant. In fact, it would be a mistake to be redundant. Yeah. So if the optional essay ends up speaking on something that you thought you would talk about in your personal statement, great. Write that optional essay, make it a fantastic piece, and now you have a whole new personal statement that you can throw forward and give them an even fuller picture of who you are. And what a great opportunity that is. Yes. I will say that there will be other times in an admissions process where you should take the opportunities that you're given. So if, for example, a school had placed some people on some sort of hold and specifically asked students to write a letter of continued interest if they'd like to, that's a kind way of saying you should do this,
right?
Right? So there are going to be moments where a student probably should do something even if it is not necessarily required, because it's just a good step and sort of a good faith show of I'm serious about this, I'm still interested. But that's only where you have those moments that a school very specifically says, hey, you want to do this? And then that's their kind way of saying you should.
Absolutely. That's great advice and great insight. I know we're up on time, but sort of last question wrapping up.
Yeah.
You know, COVID has changed a lot. However, they haven't changed, you know, you still have to apply to law school to get into law school. Sure. Has it changed anything in the application process? I know, you know, like the early appliers are considered like before December or even at the end of December, it's so kind of early to apply. Has that timeline changed for applicants? I know during COVID, the deadline kind of expanded a little bit, and is that getting shortened again, or, you know, any insight there?
Yeah, I know, good questions. And in a certain sense, we're going to have to wait to see, because some of those decisions were made after the beginning of the cycle last year, right? I think every school is going to do what they're going to do, and every school is allowed to take their own approach to the process. So early deadlines, for example, there are going to be schools that set them in December. There are going to be schools that set them in November. There are going to be schools that set them in January or February or even March. And they still think of that as an early piece of their application pool, because it comes down to what they're expecting, how they're trying to time things out. To that extent, what I would say is, you know, the students should really pay attention to what each school is putting forward as their timeline. Watch websites, don't trust aggregate sites, because it's not that they're trying to do anything wrong, they just don't necessarily have the most up-to-date information. So all that stuff is the good questions, and we'll have to see. What I will say that I think maybe changed a little bit is COVID made it such that students didn't have the opportunity to go see places necessarily with the ease that they might have otherwise. And so I think it just changed the student experience in terms of what they were looking for and what they were looking at. But I think law schools really stepped up to the plate to make sure that students could still get a lot of that same information through virtual tours, virtual counseling or visits. And so students shouldn't be shy to make use of those opportunities as best that they can, so that they can get the information they need to make the best decision for themselves, which is ultimately the goal of this whole thing.
Right. Yes. Wonderful. You know, great advice. And thank you so much for sticking with us for 60 minutes. This went by so fast. I learned so much. And
Well, I'm a
you know,
talker,
I
so.
well, I mean, this is great, and I'm excited for students to listen to this, to watch this video. For those of you who are watching, if you have further questions, especially about the University of Louisville Brandeis School of Law, you know, please reach out to Nicholas. He's amazing, as you saw today. And if you have any questions, general questions, feel free to reach out to admissions at lsatunplugged.com. Thank you so much for joining us for the hour. This was amazing.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And I should say, for those that are interested in getting in touch, I would say easiest way is just lawsadmissions@louisville.edu. And if you want to get in touch with somebody else at another school, I 100% guarantee you they would be happy to help you, happy to have you reach out. So please don't hesitate to reach out to any of them as well.
Great advice. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care and enjoy the rest of the evening, everybody.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.